Every time you turn on the news, what are you more than likely going to see 9 times out of 10? In big letters, words like crisis or disaster, shortage, breaking news, you name it. And what does that compel you to do? To sometimes go out and start panic buying and clearing out the shelves at the grocery store or hoarding gasoline. In other cases, voting for certain politicians or staying glued to the screen because you want to know what happens next and if you're going to be okay. Or in many cases, just never leaving your house. But those actions have consequences. If you panic buy, that means nobody else can get groceries. If you vote for the wrong politician, then the wrong people end up in office. If you stay glued to the screen, then you're just going to be perpetually stressed out. And so because of that, at a minimum, I'd say that's worth a second look. Namely, what is it you think is going on? Second of all, what's the reality, the truth underneath the surface? And what are some things you can do to avoid those consequences? So what you might think is going on, and incidentally, what these news media conglomerates want you to think is going on, is that they just have your best interests in mind. They're just doing fair and unfiltered, unbiased reporting because they genuinely want to get the honest truth out there. But the reality couldn't be further from that. The reality is they're doing what's called fear-mongering. They're intentionally trying to scare you and keep you afraid. And as soon as you start to ask why, that's where you have to examine their motives. And I think that proves this is the case once you uncover that, because it becomes apparent that there is a very real incentive for them to do that. So the motive is really quite simple, and that is that whenever you're afraid, your judgment is impaired, and you're therefore easier to take advantage of, to manipulate into doing what people want you to do. So to revisit some of those earlier examples, it's not at all a coincidence that when you go out and start panic buying, you're spending a bunch of money and somebody else is making a bunch of money. It's not at all a coincidence that if you feel compelled to take a side on a political issue, then you end up voting for certain candidates who then end up getting elected. Or that if you want to stay glued to the screen, that incidentally means the TV station is getting a bunch of viewers. And these are the things that the media giants want you to do. This is exactly what they want you to give into. And you're playing into their hands if you're not able to overcome that fear-mongering. Because the reality is that fair and unbiased reporting and telling the truth just isn't good for business. So to avoid letting it have that effect on you the next time you hear something scary in the news, there are a few things you can do. Number one, know that there's always an agenda and ask yourself what that is. What is it that the person doing the reporting really wants? Do they have a political agenda? Do they just want you to keep watching the news? Are they selling something? And ask yourself who really wins if you take those actions, because 9 times out of 10, it's not you. Number two, don't panic buy. The only reason that we ever have shortages is not because there actually is one, but rather because people are afraid that there is going to be one. So if you do go to the grocery store and clear out all the shelves in a frantic panic, then not only are you going to end up with an abundance of supplies that you don't need, but you're also going to end up screwing everybody else over. Whereas if everybody thought of it as, you know what, we're not going to let the media control us, and instead we're just going to live our lives as normal and limit ourselves to only what we need, then we wouldn't run into all those unnecessary problems. Number three, know that it's never really that big of a deal, and instead it's just being blown out of proportion in the news. Because 9 times out of 10, it's not even going to impact you, and even in those rare cases when it does, it's not even going to last that long. And you can look at history for examples of that. So, like for example, if you hear that the economy is on a downturn, then that might very well be true, but it's always going to bounce back and it's not even going to take that long. That's how it always has been, and it's not like things are just going to change overnight and just be 10 times worse. Number four, take things in context, not just why it happened, but also how often it happens. Because whenever you hear about something in the news, it's being highlighted as more frequently recurring than it really is. You think that it happens much more often just by virtue of seeing it there. But you don't see all the times that it doesn't happen. So you might hear about somebody walking down the sidewalk and falling into one of those great things and then think that that's more than likely going to happen to you next time. But the reality is the number of times people walk over those things and nothing happens to them is much higher. It just doesn't make the headlines. And lastly, pay attention to the language that's being used, because a lot of the times you'll hear people say things like this could happen, or people are talking about this, or we don't know if this is going to happen. And all this is just flowery language that gives people an excuse to talk about whatever they want without being held accountable for it, because technically they're not saying that it's actually going to happen. But that's just the thing, is they're not saying it's actually going to happen. So don't believe it until you have concrete evidence of it. So to conclude, take everything that you hear in the news with a grain of salt. There is useful information there. I'm just saying don't let it tap into your emotions where you start to behave irrationally. So check out one of the similar videos that I did entitled How to Think Objectively, which covers a lot of the same ground. And thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you next time.